You probably heard of the headlines: AI's coming, automation's accelerating. And the question on a lot of people's minds is, where do I fit in to all of this? It can feel a little overwhelming, maybe even a bit unsettling, but what if the story is bigger than that? What if the future of work isn't just about disruption, but about opportunity? Well, I'm Sean Elliott. I've spent my career in education and career development working alongside students, professionals, and organizations to help people navigate change and build meaningful pathways forward. And one of the things I've learned is this: when the world shifts, the most important thing isn't just what's changing, it's the questions we're asking about it. So today we're diving into one of the biggest shifts of our time, the fourth industrial revolution. But instead of focusing on fear or job loss, we're going to explore where the hope is, where the growth is, and how individuals can actually position themselves to thrive. Joining me today is Nakaska, a career planning specialist and what I'd call a positive career futurist. I had the chance to hear Anne present at a national conference, Connexus in Ottawa, and what stood out right away was her ability to take complex technological change and translate it into real human opportunity. So in this conversation, we're going to unpack what's really happening across industries, how emerging technologies are reshaping work, and most importantly, how each of us can prepare, adapt, and find our place in what's coming next. So if you've ever wondered what your career might look like in a rapidly changing world, this conversation is for you. Let's get into it. Well, welcome, folks, to the future of work. We often hear that the robots are coming for our jobs, and frankly, it's enough to make anyone want to unplug the router and hide. But my guest today wants to argue that the landscape is shifting. The horizon is actually full of hope. So joining us is Anne Nakaska, a career planning specialist and a positive career futurist. Anne, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Sean.
You know, I had the great opportunity to hear Anne at one of the nation's top career development conferences, Connexus. And it was there where I heard Anne's presentation on the incredible research that she's done in this area. So maybe, Anne, we could just kind of get started talking about what you've been discovering and maybe just hear about some things that might have been impossible 20 years ago. But could you give us a brief idea? What is the fourth industrial revolution that we've been hearing about throughout all kinds of media sources, and how are the technologies affecting us?
Okay, I'm glad that you asked all of that. First of all, what I'll share is part of the reason I got into this research is because I heard so much, discussion on mainstream media about how technology is going to come and take all our jobs, and there won't be any jobs. And probably a lot like you, I found that very depressing and not very hopeful. And so I just wanted to ask the question, is that true?
Hmm.
So what I did is I used William Bridges' work from Job Shift, where look at the work that needs to be done versus specific jobs. So I can't tell you how many jobs are going to disappear and how many jobs are going to be created because nobody really knows that. And I do find a lot of the people who are working in the field are just like you say, it is very depressing. But we'll talk about the fourth industrial revolution and how some of that is a part of those technologies. But then we'll also talk about other career opportunities and stuff in the future as well. So we'll start with what is the fourth industrial revolution, because a lot of people are not really aware of it. Most of us are still back in the third industrial revolution, which is the computer and the information age. And what's happened is out of that technology, we have other technologies developing. And the fourth industrial revolution is actually an intersection of the physical, digital, and biological worlds. And so we have digital technologies, physical technologies, and biological technologies. And I find I really like that definition and grouping of the technologies because I find it easier to think about them. The other thing that we need to know is, first of all, there's a lot of them, and I will go through of them. But the other thing is, too, is what we need to think about is these different technologies are in different stages of development. So, for example, some of them are still very much in the research stage. So, if you think
Mm.
about the computer era, the computer was around long before we ever started using it mainstream. And then it was used in organizations, first adopters, companies. IBM was the big computer company, and it was a business computer. That was who had computers. And then, I think a lot of the more nerdy, geeky computer people said, well, it'd be very cool to have these at home. And then the next thing you know, we're walking around with them every day in our lives, right? So if we kind of think about that development in the computer era, then the fourth industrial revolution makes sense too. So what's happened is, out of the information age and the computer era, other technologies have been developing, especially the digital technologies. So let's start there and talk about what those are. So the first one, artificial intelligence, is one that we're all, very much aware of. And the reason that we're so aware of it and there's so much talk about it right now is because what's happened with AI is it's gone mainstream. You know, AI has actually been around for a very, very long time, decades, in fact. But it's been working in the background, and we haven't personally been using artificial intelligence to do things, and that's what's happened now with ChatGPT and all of these other AI programs and stuff. And then we have big data. So we're becoming more and more aware of big data. We're aware that companies are collecting data, governments are collecting data. So there's a big thing around data collection and how people are selling our data and all of that stuff. So that's the second one. Another one is the Internet of Things. So with the Internet of Things, that's where a computer technology will talk with another computer technology without human interface. So that can be something as simple as something happens at home, on our smart home, where we have a doorbell or something, and it shows up on our watch or whatever. That's two computers talking to each other without us doing anything for those computers to talk to each other. And why that's important is we have what is called smart technology. So all the smart technology is Internet of Things. So we have things like smart homes, and we have smart hospitals and smart schools and smart cities. And so what's happening is there's this integration of technology, and as there's more technology, it starts to talk to each other and do things without us necessarily interacting with it. And then we have things like cloud computing. Most people are aware that we store things on the cloud. We also have blockchain, which is cryptocurrency is included under blockchain. And blockchain is more of sort of how the records are kept. Having a background a long time ago in auditing, I really like blockchain because it kind of tends to keep track of things. So a lot of people don't know that blockchain is used in contracts. It will show where the contract started, where changes were made, and then sort of the final document. So it will keep a record of all of those things. So a lot of the record keeping that goes on behind the scenes is a product of blockchain. A couple of others are nanotechnology. So nanotechnology used a lot in manufacturing, but it's also used in healthcare. And it basically is sort of micro technology. So very, very small technology that can be used. So for example, you might have nanotechnology in medicine where you have prescriptions that are, that you swallow, and it will release the medication at a certain time and things like that. Then we have things like quantum computing. And with quantum computing, that is where we're talking about now sort of stacking a lot of computer power on top of itself. So, and that's So what you need to know too is that I'm going to talk about all of these technologies in very lay, non-technical person terms, because that's what I am. I am not a tech person, but I am someone who reads and studies the technology and tries to bring it to the common people, like our clients and
Hmm.
other career practitioners and stuff. So quantum computing, if you think about your computer as being a book, quantum computing is a whole library. So you think of all of that computing power stacked up together. And so that is allowing us to do a whole lot of things that we haven't been able to do before.
So I get to
And
carry
then
the encyclopedias all with me
abs-
now. I don't have to have them on my
absolutely,
shelves.
absolutely, like it is, yeah. So that computing power and companies that are working in that area and creating computer power to do that, it allows companies to create like these computer processor stacks. That is the amount of computer power that that particular company needs and stuff. But we also have augmented, mixed, and virtual reality. So augmented reality is where we might use our phone or we might use AR glasses, and it will overlay digital images on top of real world. And so what happens is when we're using augmented reality, we're in our own reality, and then we're seeing digital reality at the same time. When we have mixed reality, that's kind of a combination of virtual and augmented. It's kind of somewhere in the middle. And so you could be doing things like you could have an image of a couch in your living room that you could move around to see how it would look before you actually buy the couch or whatever.
Wow.
So it's taking up more space in our reality, but it's not quite virtual reality. Virtual reality is where people tend to use like the NVIDIA goggles and stuff, used a lot in gaming, but it's starting to be used in other areas as well. And that is where we actually enter into another reality. When we have the goggles on, we're no longer in our reality. We're under the sea, or we're on, some adventure or trip or something. And so those are all of the digital technologies. Now, something to know too for people who are thinking about work in different areas, all of these technologies that I'm going to talk about, and I'm still going to talk about the physical technologies and the biological technologies, is they're all growing at a rate between 10 and 15% per year. Some even more so than that. Some are, like tripling in the next 5 years and stuff. So some are growing much more sort of exponentially over others. But in general, I find when I look at each one of the technologies in the market, it's really easy to see a growth rate of 10 to 15%, somewhere in that range. And then that means that there's a lot of opportunities happening because of those technologies and those industries growing. So let's talk about the physical technologies. So the physical technologies are robotics, autonomous vehicles, and autonomous vehicles actually include drones. And then we also have 3D printing, where rather than printing on paper, which is two-dimensional, we're printing actually 3D models, and they can be in plastic, they could be in metal. Um, and then that takes us into the biological technologies, where we could actually be printing with organic materials, whether it's plant material or organic material like from animals. And we can be printing things like tables, wooden tables. We can be printing things like um, bladders and tissue and skin and cartilage, which I have to say,
Wow.
bioprinting is one of my favorites, because I really love all the medical stuff. And then we have, so the other three biotechnologies besides bioprinting are genetics, neurotechnology. And neurotechnology are things like something as simple for us to understand, CAT scans and MRIs and things like that. But brain implants are also included in neurotechnology as well. And then last but not least, we have biotechnology. or synthetic biology is another name that it's known by. 3D printing is sometimes referred to as well as additive manufacturing, so not everybody knows it by that term. Um, and so when we think about these different technologies and then think about, are we using these every day in our everyday life? The answer to a lot of them is no. Some of them, yes. So we are starting to go mainstream, but I don't know about you or I, but I'm certainly not creating my own, cloud storage or whatever. I'm not doing that yet. So when we think of mainstream, it's actually when we're doing things. So I am using AI in my work. I do not use it to create my work, but I will use it to help me research and find research on what in particular I'm looking for, and where I think there might be work in the future. But we can see too that things like bioprinting is very much still at the research stage. And then we have things like AI that have gone mainstream. And why it's important to know about all these fourth industrial revolution technologies is, one, is that as they become mainstream, there'll be more and more work that's created moving from the research phase to first adoption and businesses to mainstream usage. And so then that creates a lot of opportunities that people might not be aware of in terms of the job market and stuff. But then when we think too, we think of things like bioprinting. Bioprinting is very much at the research stage. That's not something that's mainstream yet. So it will be mainstream when my grandson just burnt his hand. Well, if it was more severe and he had to go to the hospital, there will come a time where we can use his own genetic material, mix it with other things in the bioprinter, and then print him his own skin to be put on the burn. So we can use this for transplants. We can use it for things like burns and burn recovery. Or say I smashed the cartilage in my nose, we can replace it with basically my own cartilage versus, having to make up something else. So lots of applications, and not just in the medical field, like with people, but also in terms of veterinarian care as well, and then dentistry and stuff as well. So anything sort of related in the medical field, bioprinting, I haven't explored yet. And so that's the other thing people need to know is every time I go and research this information, rather than going, oh, well, there's not going to be any jobs, there's going to be nothing to do, like nothing is happening here. I find the opposite. I find these rabbit holes of just so much information that I can't possibly share, more than literally what I think of as a drop in the bucket of all the exciting stuff that's going on because of these technologies. And so now that people kind of have a general idea of that's the fourth industrial revolution, there's these 15 to 20 technologies kind of coming down the pike that are going to be impacting the workplace and how we do work. Then people can start paying attention to it, and they can start paying attention to their own industry, because some industries like the healthcare industry will be impacted hugely by all of these fourth industrial revolution technologies. Whereas an industry like yours and mine, education and career services, is actually not going to be impacted that much. And I think of it as the same as, my husband's an electrical engineer, and he worked in automation. So he did a lot of work in computers. He worked on Y2K. He's worked on automated all different kinds of industries. He uses a computer very differently than how I use a computer. And so I think we need to kind of think about that and be aware of what industry we're working in. And then we can start asking, ChatGPT or other AI services, Copilot, whatever, and say, how is AI impacting my industry? So that no matter where you are in your career life, you can kind of get a sense of, is the technology at a pace and a place that's going to replace me or replace a big chunk of my work? Is it going to change? Or how can I start looking for other opportunities within these technologies?
So, Anne, I think what I hear from you a little bit as you're trying to describe the fourth industrial revolution, some of the key technologies and the factors that we see with this revolution is our approach. Our approach is really key, and
Hmm.
I think, like you were just alluding to, it's important. What are the questions? What are the questions that we're asking?
Yeah.
For an example, my daughter is in surgical in the surgical field in cardiology, and I think it could even be within my own lifetime where many people who could have had these kinds of heart surgeries now if that had been attempted even 10 15 years ago, there's no way they could have accomplished what they're doing now.
Yeah.
And even though it's not necessarily a computer, in a sense, there's advances that have now come into the medical field where they can work on, I guess I'll be very basic because I'm not the medical person in the family,
Yeah.
but they're working on the plumbing or they're working on the electrical side of the heart. Okay, I'll
Yeah.
just put it
Yeah.
that way. And
Exactly.
the things that they can do now is absolutely incredible. And
Yeah.
we're seeing an entire departments of medical professionals that are now specializing in these technologies, if you could put it that way,
Yeah.
that did not
Yeah.
exist 15, 20 years ago because they didn't even know how to go about it. Right?
Yeah.
So what I hear you saying is about how important the questions are. So how do you think we could better prepare for some of these fields? Like I'm thinking even in some of the manual typically what would be considered as the manual kinds of fields, whether it's construction or farming, where people think, oh, well, that's just all manual. How is the technologies impacting that, and how should we approach these things?
Yeah. So it's very interesting. Um, construction, a big technology that is impacting construction is 3D printing. So we can 3D print buildings now. And so that is something that's coming up in the future. But there are also new jobs being created around that. Like, so now we have 3D printed home um, finishers. So they 3D print, but then it doesn't look quite the way that we want it to. And so then now there's a new job that where you finish off and, kind of finalize that whole procedure. um, and then with agriculture, there's two things that I find very interesting. So one is we use drones a lot in agriculture because if you think about and I married into a farming family. So what I remember is, when I first married my husband a long, long time ago, and was in that area, there were a lot more family farms. And then as the technology got better, as people moved away, um, there were fewer and fewer farms. So they relied a lot more on technology than on manpower, right? But they are using, GPS in the tractors. So satellites are helping them drive their tractors around the field. You have drones that will scan, these
Hmm.
large, large farms, keep track of cattle. They'll figure out where they need to put more fertilizer or where they need to put more pesticide. Before it tended to be an all or nothing. They would just kind of like spray the fields or whatever. But now they can, with the drones can even be used for pesticide application and stuff. So they're using them in all different kinds of ways in the industry.
The
And we
drone
have
cowboys. The
yes,
drone
and then
cowboys are showing up.
absolutely. And then we also have autonomous tractors. So we now have self-driving tractors and stuff like that. But this is what I find very interesting. So I want to share this with you because this is the important piece that people, when they hear all of this technology is coming to take all of the jobs. And it's like, well, maybe, but we don't know yet. One of the things we've been finding is there's been a lot more pushback on AI. There's a lot more pushback on AI data centers because they're not very, very environmental and they use a lot of electricity and they use up, a lot of water and resources and stuff. And so, people are upset about those things. And so what happens is as we introduce the technology, because it goes from research, right, to, some first adopters. But then as that rolls out into mainstream, there will be things that people go, well, I don't like this or I don't like that. So here's something that's happening in the agricultural world with a small company called Ursa Ag in Alberta. They have built a tractor, because there's so many costs are adding up, especially like the industrial carbon tax and other things. What is happening is it's very hard for farmers to be profitable. So you look at where you can cut your costs, right? And so one of the areas that has produced some very interesting innovation is this Ursa Ag has created and built tractors with no technology. So it's the complete opposite of what is actually being developed by the big, but like John Deere and other ag equipment manufacturers. And part of the reason for this is they built a tractor that, because of not having the technology on it, it's easier to repair. They can make it at half the cost. Well, half the cost of, a tractor that costs a couple $100,000, that's a lot of money in the farmer's pocket, right? And then you have to think about, it's even like in our cars, right? We have so much technology in our cars that it's all, stuff goes wrong with the computer and then you can't run your car or whatever. And it's a big repair bill and stuff. And so they've gone the opposite way and have simplified everything. And so this is going to be very interesting to see how, some of these things play out. So we always think, oh, well, the technology will take over because it's better and works, whatever. But sometimes that's not quite what we're seeing. Right. And then the other piece of it too is there's all of what we call, Marie Zimenoff have a 4-week course that we do on future career strategists, where we help people figure out exactly what we're talking about today, how as practitioners they can help their clients. So in talking about that, we talk about the industry ecosystem, or the work ecosystem. So if we have something like bioprinting coming down the pike, and it's going to be rolled out to hospitals, and we think, well, where are the jobs? So not everybody is going to be a researcher and creating, bioprinted organs and stuff, right? However, you might be somebody who works in the bio-ink industry. So the bio-ink is just like with our printers, right? If we think about computer technology, if we think about the printer industry is part of that ecosystem around computers. The printer is not part of your computer, but it's an accessory too. So then we think about all of the accessories that have been created because we created computers, right? We have keyboards and we have mice, and then we have laptops. We have, USB sticks, all of this these are all kind of the ecosystem industries that get created when something new comes along. And so we don't often think about those as well. And so what happens is when we start thinking about, oh, well, this is going to create this, and then this will happen, and then this will happen, right? If we have bioprinters, and eventually, when I research bioprinters, I can kind of visualize where they're going to take all of this and then go, oh, well, they're going to want to be rolling these out to hospitals all over the world. Right? At some point in time, they're going to be rolling them out to the larger veterinarian clinics. And so you think about all of the work that will happen because they're going to do that. Right? And you need salespeople, and you need installers, and you need training people that will help implement all of this stuff. And so then that creates more and more work that we don't often think about when we're thinking about these different technologies and stuff. And here's the bigger piece too that people don't always appreciate. There's all of this technology that's happening, But there is other work that is being created by other technologies as well. So, for example, the Sphere in Las Vegas. When they created the Sphere, and it's not doing very well because they didn't think really too much about scalability. But when they created the Sphere, they created all new cameras and like the audio and visual stuff. Um, so they have new cameras and they have all new sound equipment in this building. It didn't exist before. And not only that, but to build the Sphere, they had to bring a crane over from Germany in order to put it all together. So then you think about crane technology, you think about camera technology, you think about audio technology. All of that technology is not just going to sit there unused. We're going to think about, oh, well, we used it here and here. Well, where else can we use it? Because that's just kind of how our brains think. And then we start implementing that stuff and then start doing more. So these technologies, will impact every industry, healthcare, especially, when we think about healthcare. And sometimes we think the technology is being implemented because we just want to get rid of the people and we're just going to bring in the technology to get rid of people. The reality is that something like AI, artificial intelligence in the healthcare field, actually what happened is there were only about 40% of hospitals kind of had an AI strategy that they were kind of working on. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was only about 25% kind of had a strategy in place. And then COVID hit. Well, the hospitals that did not have any kind of AI strategy really struggled through COVID. And the hospitals that did have one in place were way better able to handle the pandemic. So guess what that did? That just pushed forward the technology. AI adoption in hospitals ramped up really quickly because of the pandemic. And so it's not always about, companies just wanting big profits and getting rid of people and just bringing in technology, although that's part of the equation, but part of the equation too is labor shortages. So areas like transportation and trucking, part of the reason autonomous vehicles are so popular and autonomous trucking, that whole idea of it, is because we've had shortages in the transportation industry for years. Anybody who's been in career development knows how big that shortage is. And with the baby boomers retiring, things like the shipping industry, the trucking industry, aviation, all of those are getting hit very hard. Healthcare as well, education. We need tons of teachers. And so there are other career opportunities out there that we don't often, think about, and they don't all relate to the fourth industrial revolution technologies. And that's why I like to look at, what's the work that needs to be done? So for example, there's 16,000 wastewater treatment plants in the US. Well, eventually those are going to need to be replaced. Calgary, I don't know if you've seen the news at all, but we keep having these water main breaks that cause horrible problems within, being able to use water within the city. And so just these overall maintenance issues are things that will end up creating a lot of work. The aviation field is growing and is seen to double in terms of our capacity for how many people are going to be traveling around the world and stuff is basically doubling by 2040. So you think about all the airports that have to handle all those people. We're at 99% capacity. How are we going to manage all that? So then again, there's an example of it isn't just the aviation industry that's going to need a whole bunch of people. We have to kind of get our ducks in a row, and we either have to figure out how to increase capacity at the airports we already have, which we're using AI and big data to do a lot of that. But then on the other hand, too, is we also have to figure out construction. So we're talking about less than 14 years, and it always takes, time to get these things up and rolling. 14 years isn't a lot of time to literally double airport capacity.
Yeah.
And that's just one field, and that's the construction and infrastructure construction that needs to be done, and all the people will need to do that in order to make aviation kind of work. Then there's all the jobs in aviation, all the extra pilots will need, all the ground crews will need, all the, now a lot of ground crew work, there's a perfect example. A lot of that will be replaced by automation. But then you still need some customer service people, serving staff. But these are statistics worldwide. A lot of these people are retiring as well. And in terms of pilots, a lot of pilots are retiring. So, it's over 1 million people that will need to satisfy all of these roles worldwide. And that doesn't include all the people that we're going to need for the construction. And then they're looking at solving part of this problem as well is by, increasing construction on regional airports. So doing the construction there, so that regional airports can handle more people, and that we can use AI to get us directly to where we want to go, so that we're not doing 2-3 stops or whatever along the way if we want to go to smaller serve centers or whatever.
So
So
a lot of these problems, I guess, that we're seeing and maybe have to encounter as we're going about our transactions can be opportunities to look at how technology can be part of that.
absolutely.
In a lot of cases, like you're mentioning, there are shortages. We just don't have enough people to meet those needs.
No, no, we don't. And so, to give you an example, when I started reviewing information on like cybersecurity, and the more we use AI, the more we need cybersecurity people, because the more AI is being used, by hackers, and they get more and more creative and can do more things to scam people. And so then we need people working on the other side to balance all of that out. So when I first started looking into it, I think the estimate was roughly 1 million people worldwide in cybersecurity. I'd seen last time I looked, and I haven't researched for a while, but I think it was closer to 4 million. And the numbers kind of, vary depending on who does the estimates and stuff. But I mean, the reality is, at the end of the day, we're going to need a whole bunch of more people in the cybersecurity space. And there again is another example where we go, okay, well, we're going to need a lot of cybersecurity analysts. It's like, yeah, but we're also going to need a whole bunch of people who are cybersecurity managers. So we're going to need people with leadership skills and cybersecurity skills. And we have to think about training, 1 million, 2, 3, 4 million cybersecurity analysts. Like, that's a lot of people to train. And if you know anything about an industry where there is a shortage of people, what happens is they always go, and industry always looks to the educational institutions to try and take their teachers, because they can offer them jobs usually that pay a lot more money. And so then the institutions, once again, are looking for people to train and be educators. And so that just starts, the cycle and the demand all over again. Um, and so once again, we have kind of that ecosystem of people that are serving that, that industry basically.
Which is kind of an interesting point, I guess. I guess both of us are both educators as well as we're career development professionals in the field and trying to look at these trends. But how do you think we should help educate Canadian society today in terms of getting ready, being more career ready, I guess you could say, in how we can move through this challenging time. Like some people are going, oh, I don't know how I can, navigate all these things.
Yeah.
But yeah, how do you think we should get ready?
I think one of the things is, if the government was smart, they would literally do ads and talk about how the world of work is changing to prepare the general population, because they're not prepared. So people, sort of that whole plus 50 generation, often they're intimidated by technology. Not always. A lot of people, like my husband, have helped create a lot of the technology too. So it isn't always a case of, if you're older, you don't have tech skills. But there are a lot of people who are not necessarily as open or don't see the trends coming, so they're not paying attention. So we just need to make people aware. And so, certainly sharing my information, I think, is very helpful to people, because a lot of people are not aware of it. Oftentimes parents are not aware of it. So for their students, so there could be an information night. Um, I plan on doing some work around helping, parents understand how things are changing, so they can help their children make career decisions for the future. There are things, and I do like to see things like, so I just had coffee with a friend lately, and her daughter is in Robot Club. And so she's doing a whole bunch of very interesting things with robotics and competing in robotic competitions and everything. And so there you have, some students are participating in actual activities that are going to take them and move them forward. There are other organizations too. There's one in the States, I can't remember their name off the top of my head, but they actually do camps that touch on almost every single one of these technologies. I was so impressed when I saw how many of these technologies they actually touch on, that so that you can go do a camp on 3D printing, or you can go do a camp on artificial intelligence, or a camp on cybersecurity or biotech or whatever. And so that was very cool. So more things like that would also be, really helpful, I think, for people.
I almost, when you're talking about that, Anne, I almost think we need to have these camps that just look at, so what are the problems? What are the problems in our society? Now, kids, just think about every possible discipline or resource you could bring into this. And to think now that some of the technology that's available to them is just incredible. Like, could you
Yeah,
just have a camp to say, look, here's some of the problems that a lot of adults couldn't even imagine.
fathom. Yeah,
But
yeah,
let's just try it out. Just see what you can come up with, right? Like I'm looking at
yeah,
my grandchildren right now, and they're taking the cell phone and they're doing things that I never would have thought was possible. And
yeah,
it's just in their hands.
yeah,
Just think about
exactly.
all the other technology that's available to them. I don't know if you're
Absolutely.
familiar with Jean Twenge, who came out with a book on iGen and how we talk about the different people groups, as the
Yeah,
boomers and the Gen X. And well, she had said, well, as soon as once the cell phone became our computer in our hands,
yeah,
we now have the I generation. And
yeah,
now that I think about where we're at today, it's like that's just been multiplied so much more
yeah,
that our kids now have access to so many things and so much technology that they could take a problem and approach it from a totally different angle.
yeah.
What are
Yeah,
your
and
thoughts
that
on
and
that?
that happens absolutely. And this whole idea of doing things in a different way, I've recently heard of two examples of how people just change things up. So I'll often talk about vertical farming. So vertical farming is something that impacts the agricultural industry. And so what it is basically we do a lot of growing within warehouses, but they can be greenhouses as well. And the advantage of vertical farms is they use a lot less water. They use a lot less fertilizer, than the fertilizer, getting into the water supply is a big problem. And then less shipping, because if you can have vertical farms in Canada with colder climates, and you can be growing fresh produce all year round, and we don't have to buy stuff, from South America or wherever, right? Like that, it's better for the environment, it makes products cost cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. They do consume a lot of electricity, and so that is something that people will look at. That's a problem, and so people will look at solving that. But one of the reasons that I bring up vertical farms is because I just saw something about Dyson creating a whole new different way to operate vertical farms in the UK. So they have this great big facility, and they have literally redesigned vertical farming. Um, my husband was watching a program about a woman engineer who has completely redesigned how we engineer things. And so what they were able to do was create, I think it was an engine, a prototype of an engine using this new process. And they were able to get it literally from concept to manufactured and tested with no bugs. Like it was amazing. And I'll have to read into it a lot more, because then they said, oh, well, this is going to change engineering, and don't you think this is going to eliminate a lot of jobs? And she goes, no, because this is a new process, we'll be able to do so many things, and then we'll be able to use it in a whole bunch of new and different ways. And so there's just so much opportunity, and that's why I feel very frustrated about everything that we hear on mainstream media. And I just read another article recently about how we're not going to have work, and I can't think of anything more depressing. And I think it's part of the reason why people actually are not excited about a lot of these technologies, because it's kind of like, well, why would I be excited about a technology that's just going to take my job away? And yet I find, like I said, when I look into all the work that needs to be done, and there is a lot of work, um, uh, first of all, the technology doesn't always get implemented as fast as we think it's going to. Autonomous vehicles are an example of that. When I started my research, autonomous trucking was like literally right around the corner. They were going to have trucks on the road, and they were going to be like just replacing all the drivers. Well, that was like 6 years ago. And we're only now at a point where we're really starting to see that maybe that's just kind of around the corner. So sometimes it takes longer, or in the cases like the tractors that don't have any technology, is cost going to drive it up? Is there going to be an energy problem? Because as I talked about at Connexus, energy is a big issue. The Prime Minister just talked about we're going to have to, double our energy grid by 2050. And I'm thinking, that's so far behind what we need to be doing. It's not even funny. Like, with all of the AI and crypto and everything that's, using the grid. And then, Canada is very big on electric vehicles. So then that places huge demands on the grid. It's, my husband worked for the utilities, and he said, it took us 100 years to build, what we have today. And now you're talking about just, kind of snap your fingers and double it or whatever. And it's literally what we have to do. I mean, I just read, we need to increase our capacity, our transmission capacity by 60% in 4 years to handle like the demand of all of this stuff.
Wow.
Well, 60% is, we're getting close to needing to double it in just like 4 years. This is not even like the plants and the transmission lines, and and there's a backlog on steel. Like, when we talk about we need to be, building at this, speeds never seen before, we really do need to be. And the reality is that China actually is building at that speed. And we are not, and we are falling behind, and we don't realize how far behind we're falling. And so when you talk about what do we need to do, we really need to get the word out that things are changing and that there are opportunities. So, when we hear about all of these young people and they have no work, I feel very frustrated by that, because I think of, part of what I presented at Connexus, 3D printing, 2 to 3 million jobs needed worldwide by employers who need people to help them run and use 3D printing effectively.
And if
2 to
you're
3
the
million people.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so if you're the kind of young person that loves to create and play with things and experiment, I mean, like, there's all kinds of
Oh my
incredible
goodness.
job
Abs-
opportunities, right? How
Absolutely.
fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. And here's another example too, because we talk about, oh, this will take all the jobs and everything. Okay. So we're talking about, so right now, Dubai is the leader in 3D printed construction. Okay. So they're estimating that 25% of their construction will be done using 3D printing by 2030. So 4 years, 25% of their construction. But then you think about that and reverse that percentage. That still means 75% of their construction in 4 years will still be done by traditional methods.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so although, we talk about all of this, technology taking over, and it's like, well, yes, but it's still, first of all, it's going to take a while. Some of us will be leaving, the workforce, and the baby boomers leaving the workforce is going to be a big deal worldwide. There are still baby boomers, for a few more years in the workforce. And what we don't appreciate, we often talk about, well, they need to get out of the way to let young people have jobs. Well, in many industries, like some that we just talked about today, like shipping and trucking and, some of the others, the baby boomers are keeping those industries running. If they left, there would really, there's already super big shortages in those industries. There would be even more shortages if the baby boomers left. And so what we need to do is, I like to talk about bringing in business courses. So I was very happy to learn, because I talk about we need to bring in financial literacy, because most young people are going to be entrepreneurs. That's, we've been talking about the gig economy and being a contract worker, and not an Uber driver, but more like the person who started this, building these tractors, where we need to be of the entrepreneurial mindset, so that we can run our own business if the idea comes. And the thing is that we're not preparing young people for that. So we definitely need literacy skills. That's something that they've just brought into all of the high schools in Alberta, which I'm very pleased to hear. And then and then a business course, at least one in high school and another in post-secondary, so that we start training people to think more like entrepreneurs, and so that when they see opportunities coming, they'll be able to step in and create opportunities for themselves.
Wow, this is incredible, Anne. And we start thinking about all the different industries that this could impact. It's an opportunity, yeah, for change. But yeah, there's so many questions, so many other questions that people might have, and I
Yeah,
really want to kind of encourage people to go on to Anne's profile page on LinkedIn. You'll see some of the incredible articles where she's actually, addressing some of these questions, like, how far will you go in the workplace of the future, looking at the global entrepreneurial aspect of this technology and what's that doing, looking at strategies to embrace the change, what's
yeah,
the innovation for the future, what's it like for us to work in a robotic workplace, what does that look like? So a lot of these really interesting materials that are there. So I'd really encourage you to get some more of Anne's materials. Just as we're starting to pull this together at the end here, Anne, are there any further thoughts that you would have for professionals, especially that are working in this field, trying to give some ideas for their clients who are saying, wow, you know what? I'm at this spot right now where, not only have I lost my job, but I see many of my colleagues, they're in a spot where, the things that I did in the past for years don't seem to fit anymore. What
yeah.
kind of encouragement would you give to a career coach?
I think it's really important for them to start exploring the fourth industrial revolution technologies themselves. So that's a good starting place. And how I kind of got started is I just would pick, one or two of the technologies, and then look how it was impacting different industries and stuff. And and just even doing that, it opens up your mind and you see all these opportunities. And so then what happens is you can get your clients excited about it. They can potentially do a micro credential in something, and then, when they see, let's say they've been working in construction all of these years, okay, and for some reason they, are not working in the same area or whatever. Is there another area that they could, do a short micro credential in? and then take all of that industry knowledge and to be able to apply it with the technology. So kind of this partnering between the technology and what you know in your industry, I think there's just so many opportunities. And the great thing about having industry knowledge, especially, for people who've been out of work, like who are say plus 50 and stuff and who are out of work, is that oftentimes they're the ones who will see the gaps and
Mm.
go, what we really need? We need, A, B, C, D in our industry. And lots of times they have the connections too to help make it happen. What they often don't have is they often don't have the technological knowledge because that wasn't there when they went through school and stuff. So lots of opportunities, certainly for that entrepreneurial mindset. And I talk about developing a get ready mindset for the fourth industrial revolution. So thinking globally, thinking entrepreneurially, and thinking technologically. How is the technology going to be impacting your industry? So that's my final words.
Excellent. Great note to end on, Anne. And so thank you so much for helping us to look at the future with a bit more hope, a lot more strategy. And like I said, you can find Anne's articles and her work on her LinkedIn site. Keep thinking, keep analyzing, keep looking at those gaps and trying to look at, okay, how can technology be part of that solution? It could just open up the door to something new. So thank you, Anne. Join us, folks, for more features like this in the weeks ahead as we dive into the world of emerging and transitioning careers. Until then, keep planning for the future.